Hello, my name is Stephen Upton, and welcome to my From the Air series of short films about the First World War. In this film, we're going to be looking at what the Germans called the Lorette Spur and the French Notre Dame de Colette. The heavy red line here, which runs around Arras, is where the German front line settled after their retreat from the Marne. And the arrow there shows where Notre Dame is, or the Lorette Spur, and in relationship there to Vimy Ridge. The Germans decided to settle their front line upon high ground wherever they could find it, clearly because it's easier to defend. And what this painting shows, there's a small chapel on this high ground, and that's where the Germans were trying to defend. The French tried very hard to take this hill. That's our takeoff point, just behind where the German front line was. And throughout the end of 1914 and into 1915, the French attacked this hill time and time again, pushing the Germans back all the way to Vimy Ridge. But the cost was terrific. In some actions, over 100,000 casualties. It's estimated this hill alone, over 30,000 French soldiers died in capturing it. And as a consequence, what we're seeing on the top of this hill is the largest French cemetery from the First World War. Over 20,000 individual graves and another 20,000 buried in mass graves. And those white rectangles that we saw, there's two down in the distance, just beyond that large obelisk, and behind us to the right was 5 more mass graves. We're looking just due north towards the area of Lens, right in the distance. You can see slag heaps there of the Lens Luz area coal mines. And of course, whoever held this hill had a terrific observation point, particularly for artillery fire. That slag heap that is just in the horizon now, which should be highlighted by a red arrow now, is the twin cuirassiers. That was the German front line running from there to here, and the second arrow was where the British front line was. The land in between is the land that was attacked by the British in September of 1915 for the Battle of Luz. So from those slag heaps, going north from there to Ypres, and coming south towards us, the German front line wound its way and then up over the top of this hill. And we see now the original front line from late 1914 here. Very little of it's left, of course. Most have been returned to agriculture. But on the left there is the French front line trench, and on the right the German front line. These trenches, of course, would have stretched, as from the end of 1940 they dug in, would have stretched for hundreds of miles, right the way up towards Ypres, and also from here right the way across down to Reims, past there to Verdun, and across to the Swiss border. You can very clearly see the outlines of shell holes in what would have been no man's land, but look how close those two front lines come at one point there. During 1915, the French attacked this hill over and over again, slowly pushing the Germans back off it. German narratives about the defence of this hill read of terrible experiences for the defending soldiers, as the weight of French artillery was brought down on them, relentless French attacks pushing them back, shortage of German reserves to defend it, and slowly the Germans giving ground. We're actually now directly over what was the front line at the end of 1914. The Germans at the bottom, French at the top, and those trenches, of course, would have extended across that wheat field on the right. And if you go into those woods on the left, you can still see shallow depressions where those trenches would have extended. As we pan round now back to the cemetery, you'll see 5 white rectangles. Those are mass graves. 7 in total, over 20,000 French soldiers. So in total there's the remains here buried of some 40,000 plus French soldiers. The only other cemetery that comes close to this is the one at Verdun, where there's 18,000 individual graves, and in the ossuary the remains of over 250,000. It's a little bit deceptive actually, because as you see those rows of grave markers, each one of those is not a single cross. They're two crosses back to back. You see where it's marked now there? That is not one grave. It's a grave to left and right. So each row represents two burials, because what the French have chosen to do is place their grave markers back to back. The British don't do that. We have a row each for each row of burials, all facing the same way usually. And as we pan up now towards the north, the direction in which the French were attacking, we get an idea of the sheer scale of the casualties to take this hill. For every marker that is there, another 50% actually died in capturing the hill. To the right, see that circle there? That is a new memorial for the centenary of the First World War, called the Ring of Remembrance. And within that circle there's these large bronze-coloured wall plaques with the names of every known death, every known soldier to have died, not on the Western Front, but just the Pas-de-Calais area. Regardless of nationality, they're listed alphabetically. French, British, German and other nationalities, 590,000 names. That's not the missing, that's not the wounded. These are those known to have been killed, not in the whole of the First World War, just the Pas-de-Calais area of the First World War. 590,000 names, and some 350,000 of them are British and Commonwealth. It puts it into perspective when you see so many names. And then you walk round and look for your own. My name's Stephen Upton, so I look for the S. Upton. Look how many Uptons there are. There's actually only one S. Upton, no Stephen Upton, although there is a Selwyn and a Stanley. There's a lot of Uptons. It's a very moving memorial. I don't know of any other memorial that contains so many names. 590,000. We're slowly flying north now, the direction the French were advancing, pushing the Germans slowly back. Week after week, as the casualties mounted, the Germans slowly gave ground. This was a right-angled bend in their front line, because they came down from the north, from Ypres, through Belgium, through France, and then there was a left turn for the Germans here. So it was an obvious place for the French to attack, but also this high ground was very important to take and hold. As we swing round to the right, we see the village. First that red marker's Vimy Ridge, the Vimy Ridge Canadian Memorial over there. And the French actually, in 1915, advanced as far as that, but in a counter-attack were pushed back. It wasn't until Easter of 1917 that the Canadians finally took that high ground. The village to our right here is called Blaine St Nazaire. And there's a very interesting church there, or I should say the remains of one. As we fly towards it, we'll see a red arrow in a few seconds showing you where the church is. There's the remains of the Blaine St Nazaire church. After the war, as the people moved back and reclaimed their destroyed village, they decided to leave the church exactly as it was at the end of the war in 1918, as a memorial to all those who died in that area and to the village. And that's the village of Blaine St Nazaire, completely destroyed in the battles of 14 and 15. Panning back round to the north, We're looking, there's the twin cuirassiers, you can just see it's two peaks. The German front line ran right the way across to there. Initially the French were on the left, and then the British took over this part of the front line. If you look on the road, you can see a car there moving from right to left. Gives you an idea how big that Ring of Remembrance is. We're just going to mark a British cemetery in a second. Just over directly across the top there, there it is. That's the Bois de Nolette British Cemetery. So the front line would have ran this side of the cemetery and up over the top of this hill. By the time the British arrived here, the hill was firmly in French hands, and it was then handed over to the British. The village of Souchez, which is over to the right, we'll look at that shortly when we move the camera to another location, was a terrible place. When the British took it over from the French, they said it was in a terrible state. We've now moved filming direction, and we're actually over towards Vimy Ridge now. And where we're taking off from is known as the Pimple. It was a German high point and strong point in their front line. We're looking due north, so where we've just been filming, the Lorette Spur is directly behind us. That white square next to my red car is the monument to the Pimple. So this was a German strong point. You can see the Lorette Spur, that's the village of Souchez. Blaine St Nazaire to the left, and directly in front on the high ground, that's the Lorette Spur. And the Germans slowly were forced back to where we are now. And that motorway cuts right through the middle of no man's land at one point. And as we look down and see where the ground there is broken, there's not so much grass growing, there was a line of craters here. That's it, just there. That was a crater. And there's a whole line of 5 or 6 craters. This map shows you exactly where we are, the high ground, Souchez to the left and Givenchy to the right. Now, in 1915, there where we are there, all those red markers, those red lines, is the German front line, which was way over to the left. But now, by February 17, we're right over the front line now, and you saw the craters. So we're looking down as we fly directly over the German front line, as it was in February 1917. And we would be looking down at a series of big holes in the ground. It's actually believed that under that motorway right now, there are still unexploded mines. A British engineering colonel did a survey of it, and he believed that there are dozens of these unexploded mines still under the Western Front, and in this particular case, directly under the motorway. See those chalk lines in the fields there? That's where the German frontline trenches were. French and then British just over to the right. We see the Vimy Ridge Memorial there, that white marker. And the woods to the right of that was the battlefield. There's the Vimy Ridge Memorial. The woods to the right is the battlefield of Easter 1917 that the Canadians attacked. That was the starting point where the Canadian front line was, Easter 17. You see the white shadows in the fields? They were the German frontline trenches running away from us towards where Vimy Ridge Memorial is. We're looking now down to the north, the German rear areas. And in this forest, this wood to the left there, according to the early trench maps, you can see the twin cuirassiers quite clearly now. They were in German hands. So the front line ran across from left to right towards them. But in that wood, according to the trench maps, there are 3 quarries, which were just behind the German front line. You can see the little white square there. That's the memorial for the Pimple, next to my car. That was the front line position. And just to the left was a whole series of craters, right on the edge of the motorway, all filled in now. And as I said, it's believed that right under that motorway, even today, there are still tons upon tons of explosives. But you can see clearly in the fields there what I call ghost trenches there and across to the left. And if you were to excavate in those fields, you'd know exactly where to dig. It's so clear. I'm going to bring up a trench map from the time in a moment, and you'll be able to see the whole line of craters. What you're looking at now, there you are, there's the craters. Football, Broadridge, Johns, Mildren. As to why they called them names, I've no idea. But that's exactly what we're looking at. So the Pimple was a German defensive position. The motorway was probably roughly no man's land at this point, early 17. The village of Souchez there, over to the right Givenchy, they were completely destroyed. Nothing left of those at the end of the war. And as I said earlier, when the British took over the French trenches here, they said they were in a terrible state. The French weren't as particular with their hygiene and disposing of bodies as the British were. And they said there was bodies everywhere, corruption from human waste, and trenches collapsing, and it was in a shocking condition. But it's amazing how over just 100 years this land has been reclaimed, and all we see here is a few monuments. 100 yards of trench up on the hill and these smudges on the ground. If you want to see some of the original craters, you have to move over to the left to Vimy Ridge, to the Canadian Memorial Park, where they've still maintained the craters, and they feature in one of my previous videos. Now that is another cemetery, British cemetery, a very large one called Cabert Rouge. And over on the horizon, the town of Arras. I hope you've enjoyed this film and it's been informative to you. I've made quite a few others, so if you subscribe to my YouTube channel, you'll also get a notice of more that I do. And I'd like to thank you for watching.